My name is Henry, but tonight I carry another man's story, one that could be mine and maybe even yours. He wrote to me because he had no one else to tell, and as I read his words, I felt the ache of a wound that too many fathers and grandfathers carry in silence. It happened at what should have been a joyful gathering. Family, friends, neighbors, all under one roof, sharing laughter, food, and music. He came dressed in his best jacket, the one his late wife had always said made him look sharp and handsome. It wasn't new, but it was clean, pressed with care, and carried memories stitched into every thread. He didn't come for attention. He came for love, for connection. He wanted to be near his son, his grandchildren, to feel like he belonged in the picture of family that everyone else seemed to paint so easily. But instead of love, he was met with cruelty. As he stepped into the room, his son looked him up and down. The corners of his mouth curled into a smirk, then a laugh, loud enough for others to hear. "Look at you," his son sneered. "You look like a beggar." Laughter followed. Not everyone joined, but enough did. A few chuckled nervously. Others looked away, but no one defended him. Not a single voice rose to say, "Stop, that's your father." And so he stood there, humiliated, heat rushing to his cheeks while the sound of his own son's mockery echoed louder than the music, louder than the chatter, louder than his own heartbeat. Humiliation in public is different from pain in private. When someone wounds you behind closed doors, the hurt stays between you and them. But when your own child wounds you in front of others, it's like your soul is stripped bare for everyone to see. He smiled faintly, trying to mask the sting, but inside his chest something cracked. Still, he didn't lash out. He didn't curse. He didn't storm away. Because what no one knew, not his son, not the guests, not even those who laughed, was that he carried a secret, a quiet truth, held close to his chest like a card no one expected him to play. And before I share his secret, let me remind you, if you've ever felt erased, humiliated, or made to feel small in your own family, subscribe to this channel. These are the stories they try to silence, but here, your voice is honored. The truth was this: appearances can lie, clothes may fade, jackets may fray, but dignity and strength are stitched into a man's soul, not into the fabric on his back. And while his son mocked him for looking poor, he carried something wealthier than money, something no insult could erase. He carried knowledge. He carried preparation. He carried the kind of foresight that could change everything when the time came. That night, as the laughter died down and the party went on, he stood silently in the corner. Outwardly, he looked beaten, like the words had done their job. But inside, he whispered to himself, "You don't know what I hold. You don't know the story I've written without your permission." Because sometimes the sweetest justice isn't shouted in anger. It's written in silence and revealed when no one expects it. And this man, mocked as a beggar, carried a secret that would prove he'd been far richer than anyone ever imagined. I wasn't always a man in the worn jacket, the one mocked for looking like a beggar. Once, I was a man who carried the weight of a family on his back, who worked through nights and storms, who sacrificed new shoes for himself so his son could wear the best of school. I remember those early years with Eleanor, when money was thin as paper but love was thick as honey. We lived in a small house with drafty windows, the kind where winter crept in no matter how many blankets you stacked. My coat was patched, my shoes scuffed, but every time my son looked up at me, I stood tall, because I knew that dignity isn't sewn into fabric, it's earned in sweat. There was a time when every dollar mattered. I worked double shifts at the factory, the kind of labor that grinds your bones into dust. My hands were blistered, my back stiff, but I kept going, not because I loved the work, but because I loved the boy who depended on me. When he wanted to play baseball, I skipped lunches for a week to buy him a glove. When he needed books for school, I sold my old tools at a pawn shop. And when he dreamed of college, Eleanor and I tightened every belt, counted every coin, until somehow we made it happen. I didn't dress in silk or drive a shiny car, but he never went hungry. He never lacked. And I thought, no, I believed that someday he would see, that someday he would understand. Clothes were never my measure. I wore the same winter coat for over a decade. Eleanor stitched the sleeves when they tore, smiling as she worked. "No one's looking at your jacket," she'd tease. "They're looking at your heart." I believed her. She believed in me. And for years, that was enough. But children don't always see the stitches. They see what others see: labels, brands, appearances. My son grew older, and the world taught him different lessons than the ones I lived by. He began to notice my worn collars, my old boots, the way I patched things instead of replacing them. "Why don't you just buy new ones?" he'd ask, half annoyed, half embarrassed. I'd smile and say, "Because these still do the job, and the money is better spent on you." At the time, I didn't realize the distance those words built. He didn't hear sacrifice. He heard excuses. He didn't see love stitched into fabric. He saw failure to keep up with the world's parade of wealth. And so the seed was planted, the seed that would grow into the smirk, the laugh, the words that cut to me like a blade. "You look like a beggar." I remember Eleanor warning me once. "Henry," she said softly, "you give him everything, but make sure he learns to see it. Make sure he knows what it costs." I thought time itself would teach him. I thought maturity would open his eyes. But time can harden as much as it can soften. And instead of gratitude, arrogance took root. The night he laughed at me in front of everyone wasn't the first time he noticed my clothes. It was just the loudest. Years before, he had started pulling away, choosing to spend holidays with friends instead of at our table, calling less often, rolling his eyes when I told stories about the old days. I thought it was youth, just a phase, but it wasn't. It was judgment, growing stronger with every year. Still, I carried pride in silence. Every time I saw him succeed, I told myself it was worth it. Every degree he earned, every step he took forward, I whispered Eleanor, "We did it. He's standing on our shoulders." But when he mocked my jacket that night, when he turned my sacrifice into a punchline, it felt as though all those years of carrying him had been erased. Because humiliation in public is never just about that moment. It's the weight of a lifetime being dismissed with a single laugh. I sat in that room, cheeks burning, and thought of the times I walked home in the rain because I couldn't afford a bus ticket after paying for a school trip. I thought of the nights Eleanor and I ate beans so he could have meat. I thought of the mornings my hands bled from work, but I still showed up at his games, cheering with everything I had. And he stood there, in front of everyone, laughing at the clothes that had been worn thin from carrying him. That night, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. I realized that love given without acknowledgement becomes invisible. And invisible love, no matter how deep, leaves scars. I looked at him across the room, his laughter echoing with others, and thought, "You may not see it now, but one day you will learn the cost of mocking the man who built the ground beneath your feet. Because even a beggar, as you call him, can hold secrets that wealth cannot buy." The night of the gathering should have been one of pride. Family filled the room, laughter bouncing off the walls, the aroma of food rich and comforting. It was a kind of night where bonds should have deepened, where stories should have been shared, where a father should have felt honored among those he loved. I arrived wearing the same navy jacket Eleanor had mended so many times. It wasn't new, but it was mine, a thread of memory woven through years of family moments. I straightened my shoulders, brushed off the collar, and walked in with quiet dignity. For a moment, I thought it would be enough. As I entered, eyes turned toward me. Some smiled politely, others looked me up and down. And then came the voice that silenced the air. My son. He looked me over, head to toe, lips curling into a smirk. His voice carried across the room. "Look at you. You look like a beggar." It was as if time froze. The words didn't just sting. They cracked like a whip in front of everyone. A few chuckles erupted, nervous at first, then sharper. Some guests glanced away, embarrassed but unwilling to step in. Others laughed outright, entertained at the expense of the man who had built the very life they were enjoying. I felt heat rush to my cheeks, my ears burning. My hand tightened around the envelope in my pocket, the one I had brought as a gift. My smile faltered, but I forced it back, hiding the quake in my chest. Humiliation in public is a wound carved deeper than any private slight. I looked at my son, waiting, hoping for the moment to turn. Maybe he would grin and say, "I'm joking," or pull me into a hug. Maybe someone would defend me, remind him of respect, of the years I had carried him. But no, he laughed again, louder this time, and others joined in. Not one voice rose in my defense. The silence of those who stayed quiet hurt as much as his words. I tried to breathe evenly, tried to stay composed. "It's just a joke," I whispered to myself. But inside, a storm raged, because in that moment, I was not his father, not the man who had worked his hands raw to put him where he stood. I was the punchline. I took a seat at the edge of the room, away from the center, trying to steady my hands. The noise of the gathering washed over me, but I felt like a ghost, present yet unseen. Every laugh that rippled through the crowd sounded sharper, as though they were all laughing at me. I replayed Eleanor's voice in my head. "They'll see your love someday. Henry, just give it time." But time had come and gone, and still, all they saw was a jacket too old, a father too plain. Humiliation has a way of twisting memory. In those minutes, I thought of every sacrifice I had made, every check I had written, every hour I had bent my back for his future, and all of it condensed into that one cruel word, beggar, a man who gave everything, reduced to nothing in a single laugh. Guests tried to carry on as though nothing had happened. They poured drinks, raised toasts, told stories. I nodded politely when addressed, but my eyes stayed on the floor. No one mentioned the words again, but the echoes stayed louder than any song or toast. I thought of walking out, just standing, leaving, letting the door slam behind me. But pride held me in my chair. Not pride in myself, pride in appearances. If I left, they'd say, "He couldn't take a joke." If I stayed, at least I could pretend dignity. So I stayed. My son never approached me that night. He laughed with friends, clinked glasses, enjoyed the evening. Once, our eyes met across the room. I thought I saw something, hesitation, guilt, but then he turned away, his arm around his bride, and the moment vanished. When the night ended, I walked to my car slowly, the envelope still untouched in my pocket. I sat behind the wheel, staring at my reflection in the rear-view mirror. The man looking back at me had lines deeper than before, eyes duller. "Beggar," I whispered to the empty car, and I realized that word would stay with me longer than any toast or song from that night. But beneath the sting, something else stirred. Not revenge, not yet, but a seed of resolve. Because if my son could mock me in front of everyone, if no one could defend me, then I needed to start defending myself. The morning after the gathering, I woke with the word still echoing in my ears. Beggar. It wasn't just a word itself, though it burned enough on its own. It was the laughter that followed it, the silence of those who didn't speak up, the weight of being diminished in the eyes of people who should have honored me. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, growing cold between my hands. I kept glancing at the phone, waiting for it to ring. Surely my son would call, I told myself. Surely, in the sober light of morning, he would realize how cruel he had been. He would apologize, tell me he didn't mean it, that it was just a bad joke gone too far. But the phone stayed silent. By noon, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I dialed his number myself. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice casual, almost distracted. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" I hesitated, my throat tightening. Part of me wanted to demand an explanation, to ask him how he could look me in the eyes and laugh like that. But another part of me, the part that had carried him, sacrificed for him, loved him, didn't want to push him away further. So instead, I said, "I just wanted to see how you were doing after last night." "Oh, it was great," he said easily. "Everyone had a good time." That was it. No mention of the words. No trace of regret. He asked nothing about how I felt, offered nothing to mend the wound. After a few minutes of small talk, he said, "I've got to run," and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, my chest hollow. Days passed. I thought maybe he needed time. Maybe guilt was sitting heavy on him, and he just didn't know how to speak it aloud. But time didn't bring apologies. It brought distance. Neighbors asked about the party. They said how lively it had been, how proud I must be of my son. I forced a smile, nodded, swallowed the truth like a bitter pill. Because what could I say? That I was the butt of the joke at my own son's celebration? That he had stripped me of dignity in front of the very people who praised him? At church. Friends clasped my shoulder, asking how wonderful it must feel to see my son so successful, surrounded by family. I gave polite answers, hiding the weight pressing against my chest. No one knew that the man they thought blessed had gone home feeling more alone than ever. Nights were worse. Alone in the quiet, the memory replayed over and over. The smirk, the laughter, the silence of others. I would sit in the recliner staring at the ceiling, Eleanor's photo on the shelf watching me. I imagined her voice saying, "Don't let it sink you, Henry. You're worth more than they see." But the truth is, I felt like less than a father, less than a man, reduced to an old jacket and a cruel laugh. One evening, I pulled out an old photo album. I traced my finger over pictures of my son as a boy, smiling at Christmas, running across the yard with scraped knees, asleep on my chest after long days of work. In each of those photos, I saw the sacrifices hidden behind the smile. I remembered the extra shifts, the skipped meals, the patched clothes, the nights Eleanor and I whisper about bills after he went to bed. And I asked myself, was it all invisible to him? Did he ever see? Silence stretched into weeks. No apology came. Not from him, not from his wife, not from anyone who had been in that room. The world carried on as though nothing had happened. But inside me, something was changing. The hurt was still sharp, but beneath it a seed of resolve began to grow, because silence has a way of clarifying truths. And the truth was this: my son had no intention of giving me the respect I deserved. If I kept waiting for it, I would wait until my last breath. One night, as the phone sat quiet on the table beside me, I whispered into the empty room, "If they won't give me dignity, I will give it to myself." Eleanor's photo caught the glow of the lamp. I imagined her smile, her nod of approval, and in that moment, I felt the first spark of strength return, because humiliation can break you or it can rebuild you, and I was tired of breaking. The days that followed blurred together, but the wound stayed sharp. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a careless joke, a moment of poor taste from my son that didn't reflect how he truly felt. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't the truth. This wasn't the first time he had looked at me with disdain. It wasn't the first time he had let others laugh at my expense. The only difference was that, this time, the words were louder and the audience was bigger. I sat at the kitchen table one night, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and memories began to rise like smoke. There was the time he was 16, asking me to drop him off at school. My truck was old, its paint chipped, its muffler loud. He had begged me to park 2 blocks away so his friends wouldn't see. "Dad, you embarrass me," he had muttered. I'd laughed it off back then, telling him one day he'd understand. But sitting there now, the sting of those words resurfaced. I thought of another moment, his college graduation. Eleanor had passed by then, and I wore the same jacket she once patched. I clapped the loudest when his name was called. But afterward, in a group photo with his classmates, he asked me to stand at the edge. "You don't have to be in all of them," he'd said, his tone clipped. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, just the chaos of the day. But looking back, it felt like another step in the long march of erasure. The wedding I paid for came next to my mind. The seat by the kitchen, the clatter of trays drowning out vows. Another humiliation, disguised as oversight. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Each moment I had excused, each slight I had brushed aside, forming a picture I didn't want to see. To my son, I wasn't a father to be honored. I was a background character, tolerated when useful, forgotten when inconvenient. Realizing this cut deeper than any single insult, because a joke can be forgiven, a bad day can be excused, but a pattern reveals the truth. And the truth was that somewhere along the way, I had become invisible to the very person I had sacrificed everything for. The weight of it pressed on me like a stone. I began avoiding places where people might ask about my family. At the diner, when old friends asked how my son was doing, I gave short answers, then changed the subject. At church, when people praise him for his career. I smiled tightly but felt the hollowness echoing in my chest. I didn't want to tell him the truth, that behind closed doors, I was a man mocked, dismissed, pushed aside. One evening, after another day of silence, I sat in my recliner staring at Eleanor's photograph. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed to ask me a question. How long will you let them treat you this way? My throat tightened. I don't know, I whispered. I don't know if I can take another blow. The truth is, I felt trapped between love and dignity. Love told me to forgive. Dignity told me to stand. And I realized that if I chose love without dignity, it wasn't love anymore. It was submission. That night, the storm broke. I pulled open drawers, searching through old letters, bills, receipts. Each one felt like proof of the life I had given, the years I had carried. I thought of every meal skipped, every shift worked, every sacrifice that lined the path of my son's success. And for what? So he could laugh in my face? So he could reduce me to a punchline in front of strangers? My hands shook with anger, but beneath the rage was clarity. I whispered aloud, "This ends here." The breaking point wasn't about the word beggar. It was about everything that word represented. Years of sacrifice erased. Years of presence ignored. Years of love unrecognized. I knew then that I could no longer wait for apologies that would never come. I could no longer excuse behavior that had become a pattern. That laugh, that word, had built a wall I could not climb. And so, the choice became clear. If my son refused to honor me in life, then I would no longer shape my life or my future around his approval. I closed the drawer, sat back in a chair, and let out a long breath. The decision was not yet fully formed, but the seed had been planted. The seed of self-respect. The seed of change. The days after the humiliation stretched long and heavy. Mornings came with sunlight, but I felt none of its warmth. Nights passed in silence, broken only by the creak of the house and the pounding of the memory that wouldn't let me go. I told myself, at first, that time would heal, that maybe my son would call, that maybe the sting would fade. But each day brought more proof that silence wasn't an accident. It was a choice. I called him once, just once more. He answered with the same easy tone as before, distracted, hurried. "Hey, Dad, everything good?" I wanted to say, "No, everything is not good. You call me a beggar in front of everyone. You strip me of dignity I can never get back." But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I muttered, "Just checking in." He sighed lightly, the kind of sigh you give when you're tolerating a task. "We're busy. I'll call you soon, okay?" But he never did. Weeks passed. I watched the phone on the table, like it might ring if I stared hard enough. But the silence stayed. Neighbors mentioned seeing pictures online, smiling photos of him and his wife, surrounded by friends, looking like the perfect couple. They called it beautiful. I searched for myself in those photos. I wasn't there, not in the center, not at the edges, erased, as if I hadn't even been present. It was like being buried alive in the story of my own family. At the grocery store, an old friend slapped my back. "You must be so proud. Your son's doing well, huh?" I nodded, forced a thin smile. "Yes, he's doing well." But inside, the words echoed like an accusation. Proud? How could I be proud when pride had been stripped from me, replaced with shame? At church, people praised his career, his family, his success. They looked at me with envy, thinking I was blessed. They didn't know that behind closed doors, I was a man mocked, dismissed, left in the shadows. The weight of silence grew heavier. At night, I sat in the recliner, Eleanor's picture watching me from the shelf. Her eyes seemed to ask a question I couldn't avoid. "Is this what you work for? Is this the legacy you wanted?" I whispered back, "I don't know anymore." Loneliness crept into everything. Meals tasted bland. Sleep was shallow. Even the air in the house felt heavier. The word beggar replayed in my head like a cruel refrain. But it wasn't just a word. It was the years behind it. Every sacrifice I had made, every coin I had stretched, every shift I had worked until my hands bled, all of it reduced to a laugh. I thought of the times I had skipped new shoes so he could have the best cleats for baseball. The times Eleanor and I ate scraps so he could have seconds. The times I swallowed exhaustion to clap the loudest at his school plays, his graduations. None of it mattered now. Not to him. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sunset. Across the street, I saw a family gathered in their yard. Grandparents, parents, children, all laughing around a grill. The sound of belonging floated through the air, and it struck me how long it had been since I felt that. My family was alive, but I was already erased from their circle. The anger that had simmered inside me began to change shape. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was resolve. Because humiliation can chain you down, but it can also set you free if you decide to stop carrying it. I began to pull away. I stopped calling. I stopped waiting for invitations. I stopped hoping for apologies. Instead, I turned inward. I pulled out old photo albums, not to ache over what I lost, but to remind myself of what I had built. In those pictures, I saw proof. I had been there every step of the way. I had carried. I had provided. I had loved. Even if they refused to honor it, the truth was stitched into those memories. That truth gave me strength. One night, I opened my journal and wrote, "They call me a beggar, but beggars don't build homes. Beggars don't raise sons. Beggars don't sacrifice everything for love. I am not a beggar. I am a father who gave until it hurt. And if they can't see that, it's their blindness, not my poverty." I closed the book with a steady hand. For the first time since the humiliation, I felt a flicker of dignity return. From that day forward, something in me shifted. I still love my son. Love doesn't vanish overnight. But I no longer begged for his recognition. I no longer waited for his call, because the breaking point had already come, and the aftermath taught me the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes family erases you, and when they do, you must decide whether you will vanish with them or stand tall in the silence. For weeks after the humiliation, I let them believe the lie. I let my son carry his smirk, let the guests repeat the joke behind closed doors, let the silence deepen until they thought it was permanent. They saw my worn jacket, my patched shoes, my quiet presence, and assumed it told the whole story of who I was. But appearances are deceiving, because what no one knew, what I had kept to myself for decades, was that while they laughed at my clothes, I had built something they could not see. The truth began long ago, when Eleanor was still alive. She and I lived frugally not because we had no choice, but because we had a vision. While others spent, we saved. While neighbors upgraded cars and kitchens, we held on to what worked. We patched, repaired, reused, and every dollar we didn't spend, we put away. At first, it was small, an account at the local bank, a savings bond here and there. But over the years, it grew. Investments made quietly, land purchased out of sight, dividends reinvested. By the time Eleanor passed, what we had built together was far greater than anyone suspected. Even my son, especially my son, he had grown used to seeing me in old jackets, driving old trucks, eating simple meals. He assumed simplicity meant poverty. He never asked. He never looked deeper. But Eleanor knew. I still hear her voice sometimes. Let them underestimate us. Dignity isn't in showing off Henry. It's in knowing the truth when no one else does. And she was right. The secret wasn't just money. It was a security I had created, the legacy I had prepared. I owned property he didn't know about. I had retirement accounts untouched, still growing quietly in the background. I had a trust written years ago with Eleanor's name on it, waiting for the day it would speak louder than any laugh. I wasn't a beggar. I was a builder. The moment of revelation came sooner than I expected. It was weeks after the gathering when my son finally came by the house, not to apologize, but to ask for help. He spoke casually, like nothing had happened. "Dad, we're thinking about buying a new house. The bank wants a bigger down payment. Could you maybe help out?" I studied his face, the same face that had laughed at me in front of everyone. He looked at me like I was a resource, not a father. In that moment, the decision became clear. I led him to the study. I pulled open the drawer where I kept the folder. Inside were the documents Eleanor and I had guarded, the deeds, the accounts, the trust papers. I placed them on the desk and said quietly, "You think I'm poor because I don't wear new clothes. You think I'm a beggar because I don't parade wealth. But this is the truth." His eyes widened as he scanned the papers. The numbers, the properties, the accounts. Proof of a lifetime of quiet building. He stammered, "Dad, I didn't know." "No," I interrupted. "You didn't care to know." The silence between us was heavy. For the first time, he looked at me not with pity or ridicule, but with something else, shock, maybe even fear. "You laughed at me," I said, my voice steady. "You laughed at the clothes Eleanor stitched with love. You mocked the very life that gave you everything. And yet here you are, standing in a house I paid for, asking for more." His face paled. "Dad, I didn't mean..." But I raised a hand. "Don't. Words can't be pulled back once they're spoken. You called me a beggar, and everyone heard. Now, they'll hear something else. The beggar has more than you ever imagined." In that moment, I felt something I hadn't in months. Power. Not the power of revenge, but the power of truth. Because the secret wasn't about money. It was about proving that worth isn't written in fabric or stitched in labels. It's written in sacrifice, in patience, in the quiet building of a life. I didn't give him what he asked for that day. I told him the accounts, the trust, the properties. They were spoken for. They were already bound to something greater than his arrogance. He left in silence, his pride wounded, his certainty shaken. And I stayed behind, calmer than I had felt in years. Eleanor once told me, "The best revenge is not anger. It's living with dignity, even when others try to strip it from you." That day, I finally understood. Because I wasn't the man in the back row. I wasn't the punchline. I was the man who carried the secret all along. I used to think respect was something you earned once and then kept forever, like a metal pin to your jacket. But respect isn't a medal. It's a mirror other people hold up to you each day. Some look into it and see the man who carried them. Others tilt it until it reflects only what they want to believe. The night my son laughed at my clothes, he tilted the mirror so hard it stopped showing me at all. In the weeks since revealing my secret, I've set the mirror back in my own hands. I decide what I see now. I didn't wake up the next morning as a different man. The jacket was the same. The house creaked the same. The coffee tasted like it always does. Too strong at first, then just right as it cools. But there was a new quiet in the rooms, the kind you get after a storm clears the air. Hurt remained, yes, and a sadness of the years I can't rewrite. Yet beneath it, firm as bedrock, lived something I had nearly forgotten. I am allowed to honor myself even if my own child refuses to. For a while, I kept to my routine. I walked past the park where I used to push him on the swings. I nodded to neighbors. I fixed the shutter that had been rattling, sharpened the mower blade, oiled the door that stuck. Ordinary tasks, the kind that teach your hands to remember you are still useful. At night, I wrote letters to Eleanor, letters to the boy my son used to be, letters to the man I am still becoming. When anger tried to write for me, I set the pen down until it left the room. I wanted the record to show truth, not vengeance. A week after the day in my study, my son texted, "Can we talk?" 2 words, light as dust, heavy as stone. I asked him to meet me at the diner on Maple, the place with the chipped coffee cups and the pies on the counter that taste like 1978. He arrived in a hurry, haloed by the glow of a life that moves faster than its heart. He sat clear his throat and said, "Dad, I didn't know you had all that." I watched the steam rise from our mugs and answered, "You didn't want to know." He started to defend himself, then stopped. Maybe he heard the kitchen door in his own memory slam shut, or the sound of his laugh bouncing off other people's smiles. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Not dramatic, not tearful. Just 2 words, barely above the clink of cutlery. I didn't rush to accept them. Apologies are seeds, not trees. You plant them today and see what grows. "I'm listening." I said, "Tell me what you're sorry for." He looked down. "For making you feel small." I shook my head. "You didn't make me feel small, son. You tried to make me look small. That's worse. Feelings pass. Pictures linger. We ate in a silence that wasn't hostile, just careful. Before he left, I told him plainly, respect isn't owed because of blood. It's practiced because of character. If you want to know me for real. Ask about the years that didn't fit in photographs. Ask about the patches Eleanor sewed and the overtime I didn't talk about. Ask why I keep an old jacket, even when new ones are easy. And if you can't ask, at least don't laugh. He nodded. I couldn't tell whether humility had taken root, or he was merely negotiating with the parts of himself that liked the sound of his own voice. That's not for me to manage anymore. I walked home in the long light, thinking about the word beggar. It's funny how a single word can feel like a padlock around your throat when it's thrown at you in front of a crowd, and then later, open in your hands like a harmless trinket. I rolled it over my mind until it lost its edges. A beggar asks for what he does not have. I asked no one for anything that day. I stood there in clothes paid for by a man who worked and saved. If there was any begging in that room, it wasn't mine. It was a begging for approval that laughs always try to win. The secret I revealed wasn't really dollars. It was the discipline those dollars represented. I wanted my son to understand that buying new doesn't make a man whole, and wearing old doesn't make him empty, that the worth of a thing shows itself in how long it serves you without complaint. I have boots that have carried me through 10 winters, jackets that know the shape of my shoulders without asking, a truck that sounds like an honest day's work when it starts. If my son ever learns to hear those songs, he will know what life costs and what it gives back. In the quieter space that followed, I began to do something that surprised me. I softened toward the others in that room. Not all of them laughed. Some looked away because they didn't know how to stand up to cruelty dressed as a joke. I don't excuse it. Silence is a vote. But I recognize the fear. I've known it myself. How many times did I stay quiet at work when a good man was treated like scrap? I have decided to forgive them in the only way forgiveness can be real, by living well in front of them, without begging for their eyes. I also made a small promise to the boy my son used to be. Every month, I take a portion of what Eleanor and I built and send it somewhere it will be seen by someone who needs it. No announcements, no plaques. Groceries for the food pantry. A quiet payment on a class trip for a child whose parent reminds me of me. A tool set for a neighbor starting over. When you've been mistaken for a beggar, it is a strange, beautiful freedom to give as if you were one. No one expecting it, no one counting, no one keeping score. That freedom tastes like dignity without an audience. Sometimes I pass a boutique window and look at the mannequins in their press suits. I imagine wearing one into a room just to see if it changes the way people tilt their heads when they greet me. Then I laugh at myself and keep walking. I don't need a costume to be the man I've always been. The jacket I wear now has a new patch. Eleanor would like the stitch work. If anyone asks about it, I will tell them the truth. It's not a flaw. It's a chapter. My son has sent a few more messages since our diner talk. Short ones. The kind of messages men send when they're learning the alphabet of remorse. I answer when I have the bandwidth to answer. I don't punish him with the silence that was used on me. But I also don't race to repair what he has not yet rebuilt. Love is not a fire sale. It is a craft. It takes time, tools, and hands that mean what they make. There are evenings when I still feel the old heat in my cheeks, the memory of the room turning to look. When that happens, I read one of the letters I wrote to myself in the dark weeks. You are not the joke they told. You are the work you did, the promises you kept, the way you stood when standing hurt. I read it out loud until my own voice sounds like a friend again. Then I fold the paper, put it back in the drawer, and make a simple supper. Dignity eats well on ordinary food. If you're hearing this and you've been where I stood, laughed at by someone you raised, minimized by people who eat from the table you built, let me give you the only advice I know how to give. Don't spend your life suing their eyes for damages they'll never pay. Withdraw your case. Open a new account in your own name called Self-Respect and make a deposit every morning. A walk, a clean sink, a phone call to someone kind, a task done well, a boundary kept. Watch it grow. One day, you will look at the balance and recognize the person staring back from a mirror. As for the mirror I hold now, it shows a man in an old jacket with a steady gaze. It shows hands that can still build, a back that still carries, a heart that has learned a slower, truer pride. It shows a father who will meet his son at the diner again next month and listen, not because he must, but because he chooses to. Choice, I have learned, is a richer secret than money. The choice to stay kind without staying small, to forgive without forgetting the lesson, to love without renting out your dignity for applause. I used to think the worst part of that night was the laughter. It wasn't. The worst part was believing, for a little while, that their laughter had the power to rename me. It doesn't. The world can mislabel you with sticky notes that peel off the moment you start to sweat. The true name goes deeper, stitched where fingers can't reach and scissors can't cut. Eleanor knew mine. I am learning to say it again without flinching. So here's the coda, the part people always wait for. Did he change? Did we reconcile? Stories like mine like to end with a hug in a parking lot, and a line about fresh starts. The truth is simpler and better. We are learning each other anew. He is discovering that humility fits him better than mockery ever did. I am discovering that I do not have to audition for rooms I help build. On some days, we take a step toward the middle. On others, we stand where we are and wave. Both count. The jacket still hangs by the door. I wear it on purpose. Not to prove a point, not to bait a reaction, but because it belongs to me and I belong to myself. If a stranger laughs, I'll nod and keep walking. If my son ever laughs again, I'll hand him a needle and thread and ask, "Do you want to mend with me, or do you only want to tear?" The answer will tell us everything we need to know. They laughed at my clothes and called me a beggar. That was the headline. Here is the story. I had a secret, and the secret wasn't money. It was that I do not need their eyes to see me. I can see myself just fine. And when a man sees himself clearly, there isn't a laugh in the world loud enough to drown him out.